It's just so incredible. I've had so many people come up to me today. There's many of you who I've only met on Zoom over the past couple of years. And it's nice to see and feel and touch you and to just be in person together again. Wow, we're so lucky to get to do this. So this next panel I'm very excited about. We have some brilliant and visionary people who are going to be talking through taking a lot of the ideas and the values and the principles that were really strongly highlighted this morning, and they'll be discussing how to tangibly put these ideas into practice within the business model itself. And so for me, this is really where the rubber meets the road. This is where we get to take these ideas and make them into a reality that can sustain itself. So this is, and I'm very excited to invite the panel up. I don't quite see all of our speakers here yet. Yeah, we're good? Okay, great. Yeah. So I would love to start by, and so the name of this session is Building to Operate with Integrity. And I'd love to invite up Jenny Stefanotti. Jenny runs the Denizen group. Denizen is an online forum that's been discussing everything as it relates to the new economy and reinventing capitalism and reinventing businesses and the processes, and has been hosting incredibly powerful conversations with visionaries and thought leaders on this subject over the past year. And I'll hand it over to Jenny, who's going to bring up the rest of the panel. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm really excited for this conversation. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for having me. This is really where the rubber meets the road. We asked this question, can we create a values-based ecosystem? And I would ask the question, can we create a values-based ecosystem when there may be fundamental tension with market incentives? And what does it look like to actually resolve that tension? I'm a veteran of the technology industry, and I remember in the days 15, 20 years ago at Google, when everybody thought technology was going to change the world for the better. And we've seen how the fundamental incentives of the market have corrupted that to terrifying ends. And so I see psychedelics at a similar moment, but I think there's a lot that we can learn from what's happened in the past. I would also want to build on what Jamie was talking about in the first session just quickly to give you a little bit of a context in what's happening in capitalism writ large. Jeff talked about B Labs and B Corp certification, and that's a really important undercurrent that's been happening for quite a few years. But there was, I think, a very important inflection point in 2019 where there was a shift from shareholder capitalism that Jamie spoke to. The model of the firm is to optimize for return to the shareholders, to stakeholder capitalism. And this wasn't the vanguards of the socially conscious business movement like Jeff who were saying it. It was Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock. It was the Business Roundtable, which redefined the purpose of the firm, the largest association of major corporations in the US. It was the World Economic Forum. It was even Marco Rubio. But there is a real risk that that's just rhetoric because different actors in the market are demanding more accountability for social objectives. And so this conversation is really important because this is where we're going to get into what does it really look like when you get under the hood and you design a company that is truly values-driven, both in its legal structure and in its governance practices. And so I'll just say one more quick thing and then I'll sit down and introduce Bennet. You can think about, we're gonna really challenge these questions about who owns the firm, who controls the firm, and who has economic rights associated with the firm. And if you actually map out the entire landscape of opportunities in answering those questions, you get shareholder capitalism, you get stakeholder capitalism, you get the particularly pernicious money market capitalism that we were in more recently, and you get things like co-ops, that Mata is going to speak to, and steward ownership, which was just mentioned in the last session. We'll get into that in more detail. And so this is where this is, for those of you that are really interested in this is a conversation we're going to really show you what it looks like. And so I was going to do a quick tee up. I'm going to hand it to Bennet. What's that? Okay. Let's bring everybody up on stage. And then people are going to speak here, though, again, yeah? Okay. All right, is this working? Okay, great. I just wanted to introduce our first speaker, Bennet Zelner. He's an associate professor of policy and business at the University of Maryland, where he focuses on governance, both in political institutions and in economic institutions. He's particularly interested in institutional change, which is certainly something that we need more of and we're in the midst of. And I know you've been thinking a lot about this, as particularly in psychedelics. You're a veteran to this conference. So yeah, I'll hand it to you to frame it for us.
All right, well, thank you. So I don't like podiums, so I'm going to stand kind of around here, I guess. Okay, so the topic that I've been asked to speak about today is what is wrong with the current model. How do I move? Do you have the slide clicker? Or, sorry. So I guess I'll be double-fisted for this. And which button is it? The green? Okay, thanks. All right, so the current model is sometimes referred to as the medical model. I'm going to refer to it here today as the disease management model to emphasize the fact that it views mental illness as a set of biologically based symptoms, much like a physical disease. As a result, it emphasizes the use of psychiatric drugs for treatment. It de-emphasizes psychosocial influences, it de-emphasizes things like talk therapy. The first problem with this model is that it prioritizes profits over patients. So just to give you a little bit of evidence of that, we can see on the left the massive growth in the use of antidepressants over the past several decades, so huge market growth, even greater growth in global psychiatric drug revenues. So despite this significant market growth and the financial proceeds that it's created for pharmaceutical shareholders, we haven't seen any commensurate improvement in mental health. In fact, we've seen a significant decline in mental health. So if this model is not working, which it clearly does not seem to be, why is it so hard to change? The first reason is that it's embedded in the extractive structure of the pharmaceutical industry. So to explain a bit more about what I mean by that, if you look at the left chart, you could see that the industry has become much more concentrated, much less competitive over the past few decades. So now it's dominated by a handful of major pharmaceutical players. They're able to behave relatively monopolistically due to the lack of competition. As a result, pharmaceutical prices have risen tremendously. That's what the chart on the right is showing you. So these price increases represent the form of financial extraction from consumers to pharmaceutical shareholders. These shareholders and the corporations of which they're a part are politically powerful as well as economically powerful. They're not going to give up these returns easily. So that's the first reason it's so hard to change. But an even deeper reason is the extractive structure of our entire economic system. So again, to delve into this a little bit, in the past several decades, outposts of giant corporations that are beholden to Wall Street have replaced local businesses on Main Street. One result of this is that the bulk of the financial proceeds produced in local communities flows to distant shareholders. It's extracted out of the communities. It's therefore not available to recirculate within communities to fuel local investment and local spending. Literally, local communities are being starved of their financial lifeblood. Paralleling this disconnection between shareholders and communities is a disconnection between corporate decision makers, managers, and communities. So these distant managers, these remote managers, are making decisions about how to use community resources when they have no direct contact with local ecosystems at all. This is compounded by the incentives that they face to maximize shareholder profit above all else. The result is that community resources of all sorts are being used in a way that does not account for their health or for their ability to regenerate themselves. This is true not just of natural resources, earth, air, wind, water, plants, water. It's true also of human resources. Okay, so one of the major effects of these extractive patterns is been a tremendous increase in income inequality during the past several decades. In this chart, you can see the shares of the top 1% and the bottom 50% in the US flipping. You can see the much greater wealth gain of the top 1%. You can think of this inequality as reflecting the extraction of financial capital from the bottom to the top. It's mirrored by a decline in mental health. So if we look across countries, we see a very distinct relationship on the left between inequality and mental illness, and on the right between inequality and illegal drug use, which is a proxy for addiction. We can think about this as the extraction of human capital. So far what we've got is our extractive economic system, which is reflected in the extractive patterns of the pharmaceutical industry, is not only making people less well off economically, it's actually making them less well off psychologically, which is ironic because that's the problem that we're trying to solve in the first place. All right. So the problem that I've been trying to make clear here is the pattern. The problem is the disconnected, centralized pattern that characterizes not just the pharmaceutical industry, but our entire economic system. Disconnected systems facilitate extraction. That is their purpose. That is what they're set up to do. The solution is a pattern shift, a shift to a connected, distributed pattern. In contrast to the disconnected pattern that facilitates extraction, this type of pattern facilitates regeneration. So connected systems support regeneration. And this isn't just some theoretical idea. This is nature's pattern. It's the pattern of mycelial networks. It's a pattern in which resources, in which nutrients and information flow throughout densely interconnected networks to support the thriving of the entire system and its ability to regenerate itself in the future. We must reawaken to nature's pattern in order to heal others, and in order to heal ourselves. So in order to make this a bit more concrete and also to illustrate some of the institutional impediments to the emergence of regenerative patterns, I want to speak for a few minutes about a roadmap to regenerative well-being. So this is a roadmap for a clinic. The clinic is in the current paradigm, so it's currently a medicalized clinic, a treatment site, and it's following the disease management approach that I spoke about a few minutes ago. In the next phase of its evolution, this clinic might evolve into a holistic wellness center. In the holistic wellness center, practitioners from different disciplines, both medicalized and non-medicalized disciplines, attempt to make people well rather than merely treat disease in a coordinated fashion. But even this first evolutionary step is challenged by institutional impediments. So professional licensing regulations and professional norms serve to segment the delivery of medicalized services from non-medicalized services. Here in the US, state-level corporate practice of medicine laws, whatever their original intent, also serve to silo the provision of medicalized psychological services and to segment them from the provision of other types of services. Okay. The next evolutionary step, the ultimate evolutionary step, is into a community well-being institute, what I refer to as a pollinator. In addition to providing the same multidisciplinary approach to producing well-being that the Holistic Wellness Center provides, a pollinator, a community wellness institute, also explicitly reconnects people to local social and economic systems, both in order to promote their individual healing and to revitalize the systems themselves. A pollinator is attempting to create or to recreate that complex relational regenerative pattern that I spoke about just a few minutes ago. But there are major institutional impediments to emerging this sort of pattern. The first of these, which we've already talked about a little bit today, is the financing process. Conventional financing mechanisms that prioritize investor returns above all else are incompatible. These one-way flows of capital from operations, from projects to investors, are incompatible with the metabolic flows of resources that are at the heart of the pollination approach and at the heart of regenerative patterning. The legal system enshrines this idea. It enshrines it in the concept of shareholder primacy, which again holds that shareholder profits must be maximized above all else. That is fundamentally incompatible with regenerative patterning. And then there's the risk of colonization. And in this case, I'm referring to colonization by existing by established systems and structures. This topic came up a little bit in the discussion following the last panel. It's a real threat here. Even the word regenerative is starting to become colonized. Colonization is not just a threat to indigenous peoples and practices. It's not just a threat to those on the periphery of the global power structure. Colonization is a threat to all of us. It's a threat to our collective well-being as a society. So the project that I'm engaged in, and that I think that everybody on this panel is engaged in one way or another, is to create a new ecosystem, an ecosystem that has new structures in it that are capable of supporting regenerative patterning. And the specific examples I've called out are all on topics that I think the other panelists here have something very direct to say about. So I'm going to leave you with one closing thought. The name of this panel is Building with Integrity. And the thought is that integrity flows from right relationship. Simple example is a bicycle. I love to bike. You can have the best parts, the best components in the world, but if you don't assemble them in right relationship, your bicycle has no integrity. If we want to build with integrity, we should follow regenerative patterning. Following regenerative patterning in the way that we build this field and the way that we build the structures to support this field will bring us into integrity. Thank you.
Thanks, Bennet. You are right that the default is extractive, and so often social entrepreneurs who are well-intentioned will unwittingly adopt the default corporate structures that then get them stuck. And we saw this example with Whole Foods. They made it all the way until fiduciary responsibility got in the way. And I do want to put a fine point on some of the things that Jeff was talking about earlier. There's an important distinction between being a public benefit corporation, which is an entity type, wherein you have to state your purpose and you report against your purpose, but also critically, it flips fiduciary responsibility to the purpose instead of to return to shareholders, so that gets around this legal issue. And then there's certification. And we talked about a whole spectrum of ways in which we can influence the market as good actors in the space, from the pledge to certification to policy. And I think there's sort of a little bit of nuance in that spectrum too. But you want to get back to this question of, like, what does it look like when you get under the hood and you actually put these things into practice? And so our next guest is actually at the helm of the movement to do just that. Mara Zepeda is the executive director of Zebras Unite, which actually started with the blog post, which was a bunch of social entrepreneurs, many people of color and women, who were talking about the difficulties in finding funding for organizations that would return capital, but just not the 10x narrative that Silicon Valley is accustomed to. And that there was such incredible reception to that blog post that is now a movement with tens of thousands of people around the world. And many businesses that are supporting one another and also critically thinking about the financing component of it that we'll talk about later today. So Mara's going to put the psychedelic industry and the work that they're doing there into the broader context of the work that she's doing with Zebras Unite.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you all so much. The composer Alvin Lucier died yesterday. For those of you that know his work, I'd like to take a minute. He was a very deep listener, and if you don't know him, I hope that you will. I spent most of the pandemic on this pig farm in rural Washington in a town of 400 people in the Cascade Mountain Range. And in Winthrop, I had a lot of time to be with myself. And one of the evenings that I was sitting in meditation, I had what was one of the most terrifying visions that I've ever had, which was the idea of venture capital colliding with the psychedelic industry. And that is my journal entry. This is the notion of the growth at all costs mentality colliding with plant medicine is truly terrifying, and it's why I'm here today to talk a little bit about how that notion of disruption in the most violent sense is actually a much broader pattern that's happening across all startups. So I texted my friend Jonathan Harris, the artist, and I said, at midnight, I have an urgent question. And we required a conversation, and we spoke the next day. And after we spoke, he sent me We Will Call It Paula, and that is really why I'm here today. For those of you that don't have it, we have printed copies out there. It is really the text of this movement, and I encourage all of you to read it. It will provide so much context. And I think that these dots were connecting for me for a couple of reasons. The first is a couple days later, I started to realize how many of my dear friends were exiting traditional technology to pursue psychedelics, either in their private form, in deregulation. And I actually started to make a list because it suddenly dawned on me how many of my friends were leaving. And the second is because I was in proximity with my nieces, who were 13 and 16. And if you are interested in children or the imaginal or the sacred, it is not possible to not be invested in this issue. This is my niece Maeve with her cat Theo, and she's wearing a poop emoji costume, which you can't entirely see. And that was also May 29th. It was a big day. So I'm here really to contextualize that the psychedelic industry is situated within a much broader challenge that's happening right now across startup culture that touches every sector of startups. We see and we feel viscerally the profound implications of startups and technology, or of psychedelics and venture capital right now, but that applies to the way that venture capital has influenced our democracy, civil society, technology platforms, healthcare, education, journalism, the list goes on. Those toxic practices have actually had a profound effect industry-wide. My three co-founders and I started accidentally an international movement called Zebras Unite, as Jenny properly pronounces it. I still am calling it Zebras Unite. And what we argued was that we had to find alternative financing for these types of companies that are simply misaligned with the growth at all cost mentality. And we experienced that by virtue of being four founders ourselves, starting companies. In my case, it was in the education space. In Jen's case, it was in journalism, where when we started to grow the company, the financing would have been ultimately misaligned with the audiences that we were there to serve. And so we wrote this manifesto in 2017 called Zebras Fix What Unicorns Break. And you can take a beat to appreciate the fantastic artwork by Arthur Jones. But really, this was what we were setting the dichotomy between venture capital that was enabling growth at all costs profiteering, where a small number of already wealthy accredited investors got even richer, and what we were noticing with our community, which was founders that were solving problems born out of their lived experience that could not find the resources they needed to succeed. And many of those companies were founded by women and people of color and people who had a deep devotion to community practices. So they were coming from a different place. Their interest was not in having a big payday and getting really rich and then figuring out how that was going to trickle down. They were interested in creating the type of regenerative economy that Bennet was talking about. And in this blog post, we said a company's business model is the first domino in a long chain of consequences. The business model is the message. From that business model flows company culture and belief, user experiences, and ultimately the very shape of society. We believe that developing alternative business models to the startup status quo has become a central moral challenge of our time. And after the years since that's been published, we feel even more strongly so. It's a human rights issue as well. So this is a synopsis of the difference between a unicorn, which you all might be familiar with from Silicon Valley, and the zebra. So unicorns are gearing for exponential growth, monopolies. The focus is on quantity. Competition is how they get there, and their measure is oftentimes user acquisition and that hockey stick. In zebra world, you have sustainable prosperity. It's focused on community. The focus is around quality. We're getting there through collaboration and cooperation, and our measure is user success. The other wonderful thing about a zebra is that unlike a unicorn, a zebra is real. And for those of you that aren't familiar, a herd of zebras is called a dazzle. And all of you are now officially inducted into the dazzle by virtue of being here. But the way, that zebras confuse predators is actually through their stripes. And so it's by banding together and creating that visual patterning that the predator doesn't know where to go. And so that spirit of cooperation and banding together is very much the spirit of the movement. So why this has profound implications is because if you continue to fund industries that we all care about with this type of growth trajectory, you get the outcomes that we're currently suffering with Facebook and platforms and Google and Apple and privacy and data and the end of democracies across the world. And so this model is inherently at odds, and that's what all of us will be talking about today is the solutions. So I want to just talk a little bit about the solutions. We published that blog post, Zebras Fix What Unicorns Break, and we heard from tens of thousands of people saying, what you've described is exactly what I am. I don't have words to put into it. And so we got together in Portland in 2017 for our inaugural conference, DazzleCon, and we had a flag, as you can see. And if you just take a moment to appreciate the people in this slide who are attendees, you'll see that it looks very different from a traditional tech conference. Most importantly, there are children there, which I think is a really important value to hold. I want to just contextualize this within the broader ecosystem of entrepreneurship. Where am I? The Kauffman Foundation does the most significant research on access to capital for entrepreneurs. Venture capital and traditional banking are not fully serving entrepreneurs' needs, and they go on to say that 83% of entrepreneurs do not access bank loans or venture capital. So they call this the capital chasm, and that's where the psychedelic industry is also sitting inside of, because the traditional financing mechanisms that we have of bank loans and VC do not serve these industries. But I wish to highlight here that this is the rule, not the exception. 83% of entrepreneurs are falling into this capital chasm. So I'll speak briefly about my lived experience of arriving here. The company that I helped to co-found, Harkin, works with over 400 colleges, universities, and newsrooms around the world. We work in 90 countries and 18 languages. We could not find aligned financing to fund this company, and we were doing upwards of $2 million of revenue at the time. And my co-founder, Jen Brandel, actually had to go to Denmark to find a zebra-aligned investor in order to create alternative mechanisms. Another is right here in your backyard, Drivers Cooperative, which has 4,000 driver owners, so it's an alternative to Lyft and Uber. They are now the largest worker cooperative in the country. They are not able to find aligned financing, and so right now they have a crowdfunding campaign, and you can see where they're at. So companies are resorting to extraordinary measures that are actually quite creative and are industry breaking, and we hope will influence and support all of the work that you all are doing in this room. This is mistitled. In 2020, we wrote Pivot to People, and it was the next iteration of our organization. And briefly, I'll just talk about what we learned there. The first question we asked is, how might founders of a different stripe care about ownership? So how might the stakeholders who create value own and benefit from the corporate structure that's adopted? This is our corporate structure, which I could geek out on for literally weeks, but I will just briefly summarize. We are a Colorado Incorporated Limited Cooperative Association, an LCA, and we have multiple stakeholders and shareholder types, and those shareholder types represent the people creating value for the company. So you'll see that we have a nonprofit. We're a very unique hybrid entity, which we can talk about later. The four of us have shares, so thanks to legal innovation, founders are now able to get recognition for that sweat equity. Our shares become obsolete in 5 years. So we built our obsolescence into our corporate structure. We have founding members, about 20 companies that capitalized Zebras Unite with over $500,000 of in-kind services, so we didn't have to take on capital. And then we have institutional partners, and you can see most critically that if we were to take investment, which knock on wood we haven't had to do yet because we've bootstrapped, those are non-voting shares. And this is a really critical point to underscore. When you think about your corporate structure, you can elect to not have investors have voting shares. Quickly, I'll just talk about governance. How might our culture reflect a new way of working together, communicating, and making decisions? I won't get into it, but we adopted a sociocratic governance structure. I encourage you all to check out a website called communityrule.info. The way that you make decisions is your culture. The way that you communicate is your culture. So this is roughly a sociocratic model, and when we have to make big decisions, we sit inside of what's called the general circle. I lead the classical to jazz circle. If anyone would like to talk to me about that, I'm glad to share. So this is what that looks like in practice. We have 15 team members across 10 time zones, and in order for me to be on this stage speaking with you today, that is the meeting that we held in the general circle from a vote about whether it was in alignment with Zebras Unite to represent in this place. So that's what this looks like. My participation was born out of that Zoom call in 10 different countries. And that is what I mean by governance, is it was a process, it was a proposal, and it was a vote. And finally, I'll just quickly say that we have chapters in over 20 cities around the world, from Mexico City to Buenos Aires to Cairo. And this is our chapter in China, in Japan. And I want to just leave here with this illustration by Margaret Wheatley, who's one of my favorite thinkers, if you don't know her. She talks essentially about this notion of two loops, the dominant system and then the emergent system. And all of us in this room right now, we are hospicing the old system. We're all hospice workers in this room as the new emergent system is being born. And so I invite you to join us. Our December membership is open if you'd like to learn more about the value we provide to founders and investors. And most importantly, please read Paula, which you all can find on your way out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mata. You're doing such incredibly important work. Now, remember up there a few slides ago when she showed investors not having voting rights, right? Get back to these questions that I mentioned at the top. Who owns the firm? Who controls the firm? And who derives economic value from the firm? All of that is open to innovation. But it turns out that there's a structure that has been arrived at for decades around the world that really, truly instantiates purpose over profit, doesn't talk out of both sides of their mouths, doesn't leave intact fundamentally misaligned and extractive incentives. I often like to say that Camille, Canon holds the keys to the castle. I think this is the switch that actually flips the economy and addresses these fundamental ails of capitalism that we've been talking about. Camille is a partner at Purpose US. She supports organizations in structuring with these novel and not so novel corporate governance structures. And so I'm going to hand it to you from here.
Thank you. Hi. Can everyone hear me? Cool. I have a slide in here. Is it the green button? It's not. As it turns out. Okay, yeah, I have this whole slide of why we're here, but realize now that a lot of context has been given as to why this conversation about alternative ownership, governance, and finance, and rethinking the way that we do business is relevant within the context of this community. So I will save you that spiel. I don't know about this. Cool. So I'm Camille, thank you. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Purpose here in the US. And, oh no, can you go back? I don't know what's going on. Bear with me. Nope, keep going. There we go. Awesome. So our work focuses on making inclusive ownership, governance, and non-extractive capital forms accessible to entrepreneurs, investors, communities, leaders of all forms. And our objective is really to drive systems change in business sectors critical to our common future. So we've done a lot of work in the sustainable food and agriculture space, working with baby boomer founders who are looking for alternatives to exiting to private equity. We've done a lot of work in the tech space, in healthcare, really core industries like the one that we're here to talk about today that are necessary for our survival and health. So I don't know if alternative ownership, governance, and finance is really necessarily an intuitive set of words. So just to double click on what that means for a second, as Jenny mentioned, our work really focuses on changing the dynamics of who benefits and who has power over assets in the economy. And the people that we work with are really, I think of them as like practical visionaries. They're people who, like the zebras, have run up against the limitations of the system continuously as they look to raise capital, as they look to include employees or other stakeholders in ownership, as they look to their legacy. And as it turns out, the legal structure that our legal framework currently makes it really difficult to design inclusive, equitable models. The code of capital that we operate within really is doing exactly what it was intended to do, which is protect wealth and hoard value. And so designing something alternative has taken a lot of work. We've spent the last 4 years really making it possible in the US to implement stewardship models, which I'm going to get to. Yes, please, thank you. So stewardship models is a name that we made up to describe a set of design principles that have really been present throughout time. And it's not a particular corporate form, so we're not advocating for cooperatives or public benefit corporations or employee ownership. How these principles are enshrined within a given institution really, it depends on the institution, it depends on the organization, it depends on the community that's involved, and often the process of defining these things comes from that community and that specific cultural context. So the core principles that we're working off of are shared ownership, so changing the dynamics of who by default participates in governance and benefits from value created. In the structures that we support, people who contribute to value benefit from value in one form or another. This component also, speaking to what Bennet mentioned earlier, also helps keep decision-making localized and connected to the impact that those decisions have. The second tenet is around intergenerational or multi-generational structures. And what that really comes down to is designing financing forms where liquidity isn't contingent on the sale of the underlying asset. And so we, from the onset, are designing financing forms and corporate structures that ensure that decisions can be made for the long term, that institutions will exist for the long term, that we're embedding multi-generational thinking from the onset into an organization. And last is this defined purpose, which really builds on the work of the Public Benefit Corporation movement and B Lab, which is, the way that I think about it is PBCs are mission allowance, right? If someone came along and offered you $1 million for a company or $900,000 for a company, the PBC allows you to take $900,000 if you can make the argument that it's better for your triple bottom line. The structure that we use, which is primarily a purpose trust, completely redefines fiduciary duty. And this is the part where community participation in the definition of that fiduciary duty is really essential. So the purpose of a company that is employee-owned, really, for the benefit of current and future employees, is going to look radically different than for an institution that is focused on stewarding data of users, as an example. Or one of my favorite one that we have done is the stewardship of lunar resources and lunar decision-making over lunar resources, right? So again, we're not prescribing what that fiduciary duty should look like. It's really coming from within organizations. So as I said, we didn't make this up. There's lots of examples within Indigenous communities in history, and there are lots of examples within the last 100 years or so. In Northern Europe, in particular, Denmark, 60% of their public market cap is structured in a stewardship form, primarily as an industrial foundation. But what we found is that there are examples all over the world of these forms. Thanks. So a different way of talking about those principles is really thinking about designing intentional governance. And so when we work with institutions, what we're looking at are these 5 core principles. One is, how do we create aligned incentive structures between stakeholder groups? The other is, how are we ensuring that there is the accountable transfer of control, right? Number 3, not lastly, we're focused on transparency and accountability. responsible structured exit, so how are we structuring the financing, and then lastly, stakeholder benefit and inclusion. This can take a lot of different forms legally. And so, as I mentioned, we work with a purpose trust model in a lot of cases. We really think of that as the gold standard of enshrining these principles into an ownership structure. But what we found in practice is locking in 100% of a company's ownership into a trust that's never going to be sold can make it really hard to capitalize it, right? So the way that we think about it is, how do we create a ladder of security, optionality to embed more of these principles into the legal DNA of a company as companies go through consecutive rounds of funding. And so at the bottom of this ladder, we have an ethics council, which really doesn't have a ton of legal teeth to it. And as we move up, we increase really the control and protection around purpose and intergenerationality. Please. So this is just an example of a company that we worked with last year. Firebrand Bakery, I don't know if anyone has spent time in Oakland, but Matt Kreutz is the founder of Firebrand. He started the company over a decade ago, and aside from making very delicious bread, the business really exists to serve as a re-entry point for folks who are formerly incarcerated or formerly without houses. And about a year and a half ago, he went out and tried to raise private equity. He wanted to raise $2.5 million to launch a consumer packaged goods brand. And what he found in conversations with investors were they were really into the mission from an optics perspective. But when push came to shove, he knew that they weren't going to prioritize the employee education and really, profit sharing and prioritization that he felt was core to his business's identity and why he started it to begin with. And so we supported Matt in raising that $2.5 million on alternative terms. It was very much a collaborative process with investors. There isn't a term sheet. Here's the golden term sheet for how to do alternative capital. There's just too many variables at the moment in terms of the risk return, in terms of the need of the business, in terms of the long-term strategy, and on and on and on for there to be an off-the-shelf solution. We're in discovery and experimentation mode on all of this. The structure that we landed on is a profit flip, so investors receive 90% of distributed profits until they achieve 2x their initial investment, after which time it flips and then is shared pro rata across the ownership, across the cap table. And then there's a buyback at fair market value. So now 33% of the business is owned by a purpose trust. It's governed by an employee, a management representative, a founder, and 2 community organization representatives who are active in Oakland and who work directly with the folks in Matt's team. And over time, that trust will grow to 100%. We have had the privilege of participating in this trust, and Matt is kind of my favorite founder, although I don't like to have favorites. He's kind of my favorite founder. And he's been leading this incredibly mission-driven business for a decade, right? And we set up the trust, and we're going through this whole process. And because these community allies are in the room, all of a sudden they start asking all these questions, like, oh, you say that your supply chain is really oriented around the community, but what does that look like in practice? And over the course of the last year and a half, by default of having this multi-stakeholder governance have a seat at the table, it is really shifted the way that this already mission-driven business has thought about its operations and its treatment of people. And there are dozens of other examples, so thanks.
I know some people think that once you get into the legal jargon, it gets a little bit dry, but this is what gets me really excited. This is where the magic happens. Thank you so much. And the work that they're doing is so extraordinarily important. And, I like to say that the legal code is really where, it's like the hardware, right? What does the software look like? And so some of these models, like, even stakeholder capitalism, you have a lot of flexibility in what those governing structures look like. they're inherently more fragile if it's not in the legal code because they're contingent on who sits in those seats. But there are less fragile ways to structure that. And again, there's a lot of room for innovation and new ideas, and a lot of that's happening in the Zebras Network. So our next guest is actually going to talk about the software. Sutton King is an Indigenous rights advocate and a social entrepreneur. She's the founder and president of the Urban Indigenous Collective, and she's going to speak to creating culture and governance within a more progressive structure.
Poso, Sekoli, Sutton King, Naktau, Pinuki, Nukyat, Sungwahue, Ni'i, Wagnata, Nawagita Lota, Oniota Aga, Ni'i. Hello. Welcome to what we call Lenape Hoking, so-called New York City, on the island of Manhattan. And I just want to acknowledge the ancestors before us and those who currently occupy this land, the urban natives. I speak in my language to reclaim what was taken from us, what was stolen. The language, the land, the medicine, the culture. We reclaim to revive. When I introduce myself, I share that my name is Sutton King, that's my English name. My Menominee name is Naktau Pinuki, and that means comes first woman in Menominee. I am humbled to have embarked on so many firsts for my family, for my community, and for our traditions. First also is this picture. It's not just a random picture of me jumping. I had graduated in 2020 with my master's in public health from NYU, the first in my family to do so. I identify as Afro-Indigenous, coming from both the Menominee and Oneida Nations from Wisconsin, descendant. As an Indigenous rights activist, a social entrepreneur, and a researcher, I feel deep accountability to Indigenous communities, to our mental health, to our culture, and to our traditions. I came to Lenape Hoking actually 10 years ago, this year, to better understand both the historical and intergenerational trauma that plagued my family and many of our Indigenous communities. My story is one of many. I focused on really understanding the psychology behind that, but it was with my relationship with plant medicine that I really understood the traumas that flew through our DNA. I decided to really dedicate my life to scaling and developing innovative solutions to improve the access to mental health care resources for our communities, and really have centered access and benefit sharing, and really understanding the cultural appropriate methodologies that we can implement, whether it be in healthcare, business, or technology. And today, my task is to share with you my thoughts around inclusive stakeholding and reciprocity. But I can't do that without sharing who I am, who Naktau Pinuki is, and where I come from. Being both Menominee and Oneida, if you are familiar with New York, that is a map of New York upstate. Being Oneida, I am of the Haudenosaunee of the Iroquois Confederacy. That's 6 New York nations that band together to fight westward expansion. At times we were intertribal warfare was at hand. We decided to come together because we understood how strong we were together. The picture on the right, it's my grandfather, Chief Oshkosh, and on his lap is my great-grandfather. I am the granddaughter of the last chiefs of the Menominee people. And my grandfather did something that has inspired me throughout my life. He was able to walk in 2 worlds. He ensured that the Menominee people were not forcibly removed or relocated from our ancestral lands. He slowly bartered our acres, and today, the Menominee people are still where our ancestral and creation story started. The understanding that he had of sustainability is why we have one of the most beautiful, dense forests today, the Menominee Forest, which many don't know that the floors of the Olympics come from our forest. The floors of many of your favorite NBA teams come from our forest. And that teaching of sustainable forestry was so important that many come from all over the world to learn about our forest and our practices. I share that because this concept of 7 generations is a principle that I live my life by, really understanding that the decisions that we make today and how they will have an impact on the 7 generations in front of us, the future, our youth, our community, are so important. And I share this also because these teachings, this ancestral wisdom, when I come into a room, when I have a seat at the table, it's not just me. My ancestors stand behind me. When I come into a table and I sit, my teachings, my traditional ways protect me. And they continue to help me to honor the decisions that I make, the companies and the organizations that I align myself with, and the way I think through our teachings and, again, our future generations. Now, something that is also important, while we have this buzzword of diversity, equity, inclusion, where I assure you it's so important, but that is nothing new to Indigenous peoples. What we call that is kinship, right? And kinship is something that many Indigenous communities have based their societies around, understanding that the interrelation and interdependence, whether that's inanimate or animate, needs to work in harmony to achieve balance here on Mother Earth. And so again, when I come into these rooms, these are the principles and the teachings that are guiding me. And many of you have felt kinship when you experience plant medicine or psychedelics. And I think it's important that we continue to center these teachings of kinship or sustainability, no matter what room we enter. I am the co-founder and president of the Urban Indigenous Collective, which is an Indigenous-led public health organization, breaking ground on one of the first intertribal mental health care clinics here in Lenape-Hoking. We launched our community center in April of 2022, but we move at the speed of trust. So it's something that is so important to us to center co-creation, to center consultation. We see that as protocol. We are led by a board of Indigenous leaders, advocates, who really help us to stay grounded in those teachings and those ways. I'm also the co-founder of Shock Talk, which is a telebehavioral application that is centered around a stakeholder model that has given a portion of its equity back to the community here in New York City to support access to mental health resources. So a lot of people ask, where did this girl come from? This is where I came from. And so as I did this work, I was humbled to be nominated as a David Prize nominee, named a visionary of New York City. And with that, thank you. Thank you. And with that, there was an article in the New York Times that talked about our work and what we were doing and our hopes for community, the way that we have centered community health needs assessments to inform our programming, to inform our community center location and the mental health resources that we use and we build. It's all community-informed, community-led. And a company named Journey Collab read about me and read that article. And at that time, they had had 250 conversations with people in the space, whether that be researchers, whether that be therapists, elders, Indigenous representatives, and voices. And they understood to create a ethical psychedelic company that they needed to bring on an Indigenous voice and that they needed to mirror many ways that have been laid before them, and that being the Nagoya Protocol, and that being consultation. So Journey Collab, if many of you are not familiar, is a pharmaceutical company. It's a mission-driven pharmaceutical company, and it's developing psychedelic treatments for addiction. And the mission of Journey really lies in the heart of the Journey Reciprocity Trust. And this trust is an irrevocable trust that houses 10% of the company's founding equity to support the medicine where it comes from, that being the land, the Indigenous communities, and where it's going, that meaning mental health care access, right? Really looking at supporting the entire ecosystem. Izzy said something so important, that it's not just about cutting a check and giving money, it's about land back, right? And what's so beautiful about this trust, it's an Indigenous-led trust, and the Indigenous trustees have the autonomy to co-create what that looks like in terms of access and benefit sharing. And we're so excited to be able to have an irrevocable trust that can embody the 7 generations. And as a trustee, it is my task and accountability to ensure that that trust is stewarded in a good way. I'm also, I wear many hats, I'll say. Many Indigenous peoples do. There's a lot of work to be done. So I serve as the Indigenous Program Officer for River Styx, and I serve on the Operations Committee of the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund. This is a picture of me from just actually a few weeks ago with the Yaqui people, and really sitting at their intertribal clinic that's being used to support the healing and wellness of their Indigenous communities. The Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund is a high-impact strategic fund really created to ensure that Indigenous communities and organizations can succeed in their own biocultural conservation efforts. It's so important that we do not get lost in just the commodification of these medicines without thinking about protecting where these medicines come from. And so when we think about Journey Collab and this trust that's been created, something like the trust, it's something that could, possibly support something like the fund. But it's important to note that the fund is led by Indigenous-led body, a governance system, and it is up to the fund and that trust to decide who donates, who comes into that space, what the criteria to accept that those donations are. It's also important to understand that it is an honor to support something like the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund that supports 5 keystone biocultural medicines, that being ayahuasca, iboga, bufo, mushrooms. Again, I just want to leave you with this. I know I'm running out of time. Us Indigenous peoples, we can talk for a while here. So much to cover. But we don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? So many Indigenous leaders before us have created pathways, meaningful pathways, framework, whether that be the Nagoya Protocol from the United Nations that looks at access and benefit sharing from genetic resources, whether that be free, partner-informed consent that really centers co-consultation and co-creation as we develop these businesses that profit from our traditions and our cultures. 80% of the world's biodiversity is upkept by Indigenous peoples. And that is because we know how to treat the land. We know how to take care of the land. We are stewards of the land. And so when you bring in Indigenous peoples and voices, it's not just out of charity. It helps you create a better business, a more successful business. And with that, I want to also just leave you with reciprocity is not transactional, it's relational. Yeah. And it is dependent on many, many seeds that are planted and so much intention to grow that. Thank you. Yako, Makwa Wailing.
Thanks so much, Sutton. That reciprocity point is so critical. We talk about an economy that's fundamentally not transactional, but is circular, not just in our materials use, but in our relations. And this conversation, I think, really also highlighted how much innovative scope there is around what governance looks like. There's not one-size-fits-all models. Different organizations can experiment and learn from one another, but it also highlights how much we already know that we've forgotten. Whether that's from nature, as Bennet talked about, whether that's from indigenous wisdom, or even that's from just the last several decades of corporate experimentation around the world. So thanks everyone so much for your contributions. We've got 10 minutes for Q&A. Does anyone have any questions?
We'll have time for 3 questions.
Oh, keep it. Thank you, everybody. Colin, Executive Director of the Brooklyn Psychedelic Society. We're trying to make psychedelic healing a publicly accessible good, like libraries do for books, by helping the 110 psychedelic societies around the country convert into psychedelic co-ops. So Bennett's on my board. Just wanted to say hello. Thank you guys for speaking. I know there is a panel later on different sorts of funding mechanisms, but I was wondering, from your angles, the panel, what sort of regenerative novel funding options there are for alternative community-based healing modalities. Thank you.
Who wants to lead?
I mean, so I mentioned Zebras Unite as a hybrid. We have a nonprofit, and that nonprofit has an independent board, and that we have to have an arm's length relationship, the co-op and the nonprofit. I will say that if you can devise a relationship if your for-profit entity can devise a relationship in as kosher and above board of a way as possible, and Jenny Kassan's nodding vigorously here, to deliver services through nonprofit contracts. There is foundation money out there, and so right now, in year end as an example, we have $1 million that is going, the nonprofit has to hold it, and then it creates a contracting process in order for a co-op to serve it, as an example. That is the most direct path that I've seen, not only for zebras, but also for any zebra-aligned company, is to create a relationship, whether it's through fiscal sponsorship or through spinning out your own nonprofit, of having some type of way to deliver on grant-funded contracts. And so I'm happy to talk about that later, but it's something that's available right now, and it's a lever to pull. So yeah, glad to talk offline, and really good to see you, Colin. Yeah.
Do you want to say something, Bennet?
Yeah, I was just, so there's an organization that I work with, the Transformative Capital Institute, whose mission is to fund and support regenerative projects in the areas of wellness, clinics, for example, food and commerce. And we've developed a mechanism that will go into effect next year. It's called the New Economy Wealth Engine. And it's an investment fund that focuses on investments in cryptocurrencies and technologies that support the decentralization of financial infrastructure. And this fund then makes grants to projects that we choose to support. So the investors in the fund get a cap return. There's a waterfall structure. They also receive a tax benefit for the grants that go to the projects. And importantly, they have no control over the projects. And I think it's really critical to create those sorts of barriers to, because even the most well-intentioned investors will end up imprinting old patterns on projects that are trying to emerge new patterns. So this is an example of something that we're going to try.
The only bit I'll add is that we've seen a lot of success with mixed capital stacks. So a combination of grant funding, also in some cases public funding, crowdsourcing, traditional investors, debt. Yeah, there's often a coalition of unlikely allies around these projects.
I would also add really quickly also that this is actually where a lot of well-intentioned entrepreneurs get stuck and aren't able to implement these more progressive structures because of the issues with accessing capital, because this is fundamentally what we in economics call a coordination failure. Because if all of the finances aren't doing it, then nobody has started. So I think actually this is a very ripe area for collaboration with investors to think about experimentation with novel models or preferencing these types of progressive corporate governance structures, particularly with generational transitions happening with family wealth. I think that that's a very ripe opportunity for the space.
I will just shout out Jenny. I mean, you have you probably have the country's expert sitting right here in the second row. So Jenny Cassan's coursework in raising alternative capital, I will be the plug for her, but we owe such a huge debt of gratitude to Jenny for all of the extraordinary innovation that she's brought. So read her book, take her course, but that's the first place I would suggest. Yeah. Is it just your name, Jenny Cassan? Oh, Jenny speaking. Yeah, so jennykassan.com. Yeah. Yeah.
I will just add that our inboxes are filled to the gills with entrepreneurs and businesses that are looking for aligned investors to come on a journey with them. And the challenge consistently is capital. And we're working with 11 different funds launching for shared ownership, but there's so much needed in this space. The adage of put your money where your mouth is in this room is one we should live up to.
I think one more really important point we didn't make about the steward ownership models is a lot of times companies aren't able to initially structure that way, and they convert when they hit escape velocity. They'll buy out their initial investors, and then they'll convert to those models. You see that a lot.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Adriana Kertzer, and I'm a partner at Plant Medicine Law Group. I have a question for Sutton. You said two words that I do not hear very often in the psychedelic context. The Nagoya Protocol. Geeky UN, newly issued directive, whatever you want to call it. I was hoping that you could shine a light on how the Nagoya Protocol is entering conversations in the psychedelic space, and perhaps if it's affecting Journey Collab, speak to that.
Sure. So the Nagoya Protocol is a multilateral, really, treaty and framework that was designed by the United Nations and really looks at access and benefit sharing, and really looks at just benefits arising from genetic resources. There's 193 signatories. Surprisingly, the United States is not a signatory. Wow. But Journey Collab understood just the spiritual and ecological implications of taking synthetic mescaline through FDA, and understood that it was their responsibility to create a trust that holds that 10%, right, to ensure that the future generations have access to their plant medicines, their ceremonial ways, like Izzy said, land back. And so I think that a lot of folks in this space are starting to think about how they can, too, show up and really be inspired by what the Nagoya Protocol has set before us. I think there are many different ways that we can look at access and benefit sharing. I think there's room to be innovative in the way that we're doing that. And I think there's a number of other companies who are also doing that. I know that Woven Science is one of them. So it's really exciting to see these frameworks that many Indigenous leaders before us have spent so much time creating finally being utilized, right? Like I said before, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are so many different frameworks and pathways that we can utilize to show up for the Indigenous peoples and other stakeholders who are oftentimes alienated from the value creation that the space brings. So I think it's an exciting time. I think that, again, the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund is a great vehicle to ensure that Indigenous peoples continue to have access to the resources that we so violently need right now. Again, I'm in a robust place called New York City, right, with one of the best healthcare infrastructures. That I'm fighting on the ground for a intertribal healthcare clinic, just so that urban natives here can have access to culturally appropriate resources. And so I think that the Nagoya Protocol is starting to really ensure that people are sharing that wealth, that they're legally obligated to do so, right? I think that we owe a tremendous amount of respect to Indigenous peoples who got us to this place, right? Indigenous peoples are the ones who have stewarded and protected these plant medicines, our ceremonial ways, even when, we were criminalized. So I'm happy to talk more about this offline. I could talk all day about it.
One more question.
Hi, my name is Emma Knighton, and I'm a trauma therapist and also on the leadership team for the American Psychedelic Practitioners Association. I've been hearing you all and a lot of the people talk about healing from colonization, white supremacy, culture, and capitalism, and thank you for all of your work. And I would love to hear from any of you about how you hold that internally, right? As a sense of our own relationship with these systems. If we're going to change them as a collective, we have to do our work in our personal relationships with them. And so I'm curious how you all sit with that and how you work with that in the moment-to-moment experiences of doing this work as a global collective.
I'll just share very quickly. I always say I'm not self-made, I'm community-made. I'm ancestor-made. And to stay grounded in this work of walking in two worlds is difficult as an Afro-Indigenous person. As I shared, my grandfather being able to walk in two worlds to ensure that the Menominee people stayed on our land connected to our plant medicines, our traditions. Fortunately, he died at 400 pounds in an alcoholic brow, because of the impact of colonization, of this firewater that was given to us. And so for me, it's so important to stay rooted in community, whether that's my urban Native community here in Lenape-Hoking, or whether that's my communities back home in Wisconsin, the Menominee and Oneida Nations. For me, growing up in ceremony was so important. I was a jingle dress dancer. And so to continually go back home and sit with community or sit with other Indigenous communities reminds me of why I do the work, reminds me of why I need to continue doing the work, and it reminds me of why I fight for what I fight for.
I've heard myself say this so often over the last couple of years, but it feels like we, on my team, have whiplash from having 1 foot in the old system and 1 foot in this emerging system. And it, both in building an organization and working with dozens of organizations that are trying to walk that line, we have seen consistently the tensions and trade-offs, short-term, long-term, personal, collective, and over again in trying to build something new inside the old. I think what has been a buoy and a huge source of inspiration is the number of people who are deciding to walk that harder path, who could do it easier. They could go raise conventional capital. They could prioritize their private wealth over the benefit of others. They could sell out. They could do this. They could do all these things. And they are sticking in every decision that they make. And it's hard to a higher set of ideals. And so I think it's not a party by any means, but I think that it's like you can see the light cracking through.
Yeah, amen. I'll just say, with Zebras, our first employee, she's Shah is Muslim, and she helped us to design 2.5% of our top line revenues to go into. It's inspired by this Muslim construct called zakat, which is a tax on business profits in order to go back to the community. And we've just been so saturated with, by virtue of us having 20 different chapters around the world, all of the different cultural practices and the ways that they express. So, I would say that that's really a gift of this work, is to have exposure and to learn from and to just be a humble learner of as many cultures as possible. I would say brass tacks-wise, you need process in order to hold those conversations. So whether it's borrowing from, Amanda Ripley's book, High Conflict, whether you're taking the lead from transformative justice processes, whether you're borrowing documentation from cooperatives, when there is a sticky issue, to create a container to then be able to have a conversation and to figure out how you're going to decide moving forward. I oftentimes say that co-op work is inner work. I've never grown so much as a human as this last year of having to be in relationship and just having to constantly hold and process and be in community and not have hierarchical power structures that in the traditional corporate setting would be like, this discussion's over, next, and we all see how that goes. So that's how it is at Zebras.
Yeah, I'm going to speak quick. We'll be quick. We're going into lunch, so.
All right. So
It's a really important question. So.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think that we all unavoidably bear the imprint of the system that we live in, the scarcity thinking and the toxic behavior that creates, even those of us who are most enlightened. I'm working on a research project right now with my colleague Rochelle Sampson, who's here someplace today, and Casey Palios, who's sitting here in the front row, in which we're going to be examining the effects of, or the ability of psychedelic experiences held in a container of support for regenerative leadership. We're going to be examining this in a research project to see if we can start to help use psychedelics to lift this scarcity imprint from people who are in positions of leadership. And I hope that that can also be something that spreads out and becomes a practice in the default world eventually.
Yeah, I know I'm standing between everyone and lunch, so I'm going to make this really quick, but this is such an important question, and I thank you for asking it. Because what we're after in the conversations that I host is asking this question about what does a fundamentally just regenerative society look like, and how do we get there from here? And our center of gravity is in economics, but we talk about culture, spirituality, we talk about oppression, we talk about tech, we talk about governance. But these questions and that's why the psychedelic piece is so important. Like, we have, to Bennet's point, internalized. We have been socialized into this system. We can't just step out of the matrix. But if we don't root out those stories and those frames, we'll replicate them in our new models. And so doing that internal work and having these conversations are absolutely essential to realize this vision that we talk about for the future. So thank you so much for raising that point. And so I think it looks like having the hard conversations, having a spiritual practice, but I think also really critically is like you can't flip the switch. Our website is becoming Denizen because we talk about it being a practice that you commit to and you continually strive towards and you stumble and you learn from, practice, not perfection, because perfection is impossible because we're not there yet. So thanks to everyone for an amazing conversation and panel. Did you want to transition us to dinner? To lunch?
I want to just tie off this morning session with a couple of reminders and a couple of acknowledgments. First is that why are we going to all this trouble, and why are we going to such great effort to make our lives more difficult to raise money and operate businesses? And the important answer is what happens in the room with people. If you have a business model that is premised on taking people who are vulnerable and in need of healing and experiencing such great challenge in their life that they're willing to undergo a very intense, very risk-laden experience in order to gain healing, and the governance structure of your organization only encourages you to produce volume and turn the dial and grow the numbers and hit the metrics and look at what's at the columns in your spreadsheet on your reports, you are going to dramatically increase the risk of damaging people's lives by having reckless care delivered to people undergoing the most vulnerable experience of their life at a time in which they are already weak and in need of healing. And that is why it is worth the trouble to build an organization that can be governed in a way that holds what is needed in that room with a vulnerable person as the first priority, and not something to maybe look into after the numbers have hit target. I also want to acknowledge, why are we spending so much time talking about Indigenous communities right now in the psychedelic world? There are many great reasons for that, but one I want to draw attention to is that the largest psychedelic organization in the world is and has been for a very long time the Native American Church. There are hundreds of thousands of members. Indigenous communities have demonstrated that they have the strength of community and wisdom and responsibility to work very safely and responsibly with these medicines from generation to generation, and they do so at almost no cost. There are no million-dollar funding opportunities in that world, and they have demonstrated a level of understanding and responsibility that people who have weak communities and only think in terms of transactions have to spend a fortune trying to replicate through a network of professional transactions, because it does not begin with trust. And it's something to pay attention to and have great respect for. I also want, just a show of hands here, who has ever been to a psychedelic community event with a real Flemish tapestry before? Anyone? I mean, this is amazing. I also want to make a couple of quick acknowledgments. I want to thank again Vine Ventures for being title sponsor for our conference. I would like to thank Dr. Amanda Itzkoff and Curated Mental Health for paying for the lunch we're about to enjoy and being our day sponsor and also providing COVID testing to keep us safe. And I also want to thank and acknowledge Tony Greenberg and Dr. Broners for providing sponsorship support for this program so that we could help make some more seats accessible to people who would not otherwise be able to attend but very much deserve to do so. Thank you again.